In the name of God, may the peace and blessings of God be upon you, everyone. We welcome you in this seminar that speaks about Iran and Israel's war on Gaza. Today, we will focus on a very important regional actor, which is Iran. We have two speakers, Dr. Marwan Kabalan, Dr. Mehran, actually, who's going to take the floor first and is going to speak, and then we will give the floor to Dr.
Thank you very much.
15 دقيقة دكتور مهران. 15 minutes.
15 minutes.
Okay,
yeah,
thank you.
15 minutes. Thank you. Thank you all for being here and under very tragic circumstances as we witness genocide unfolding. I apologize for not being able to speak Arabic, and so I'll deliver my remarks in English. The position of Iran is something that has been quite vexing and has been something that's been closely watched, and I wanted to spend a few minutes going over the Iranian position, which in many ways, I have to admit, I personally have found somewhat surprising and rather unexpected. I think the position of Iran and the larger question, larger issue of Iran and the ongoing war in Gaza can be divided into political and diplomatic issues on the one hand, and there's a military dimension on the other. And I want to talk about both of them. So first and foremost, like almost everyone else, Iran was caught off guard and was surprised by the events that unfolded on October 7th. In fact, United States intelligence itself said that Iran was caught off guard, and Iranian intelligence in general and Iran's Revolutionary Guards in particular were unaware of the attack that occurred on October 7th. And this surprise that Iran experienced resulted in an initial volley of contradictory and often confused statements coming out of Tehran. In fact, on October 8th, the next day, the day after the attack, Iran warned Israel that if Israel were to invade Gaza, there was an implication that Iran would get involved and that an attack on Gaza would result in Iranian involvement. But then we see almost immediately, a couple of days later, Iranian statements coming out of Tehran and Iranian representatives at the United Nations moderating Iran's position. And so there was a sense of we see within a week, Iran has moderated or changed its position. On October 14, the Iranian foreign minister traveled here to Doha and met not only with the Qatari prime minister and foreign minister, but critically, he met with the leadership of Hamas. He met with Ismail Haniyeh, and he met with at least two other members of the Hamas leadership, Khalil al-Haya and Mohammad Abu Mazrouk. And I was actually quite surprised that the Iranian foreign minister was allowed by his Qatari hosts to meet with the head of Hamas, because during that meeting, we saw pictures of them hugging, we saw pictures of close collaboration or coordination, discussion. But it came out the following day that in that meeting, Amir Abdullahian had told Ismail Haniyeh that Hamas needs to release civilian hostages. Civilian Israeli hostages needed to be released. The next day, in fact, within the Iranian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Iranians released a circular to Iranian diplomats that the official position of the Islamic Republic is that civilian Israeli hostages need to be released by Hamas. Amir Abdullahian then repeated this at his speech in the United Nations on October 26th. He said Iran stands ready to lend humanitarian assistance, and he explicitly said on October 27th that Iran was calling for the release of Israeli civilian hostages. He said that in an interview with Bloomberg Television on October 27th. So in hindsight, we see why the Qatari hosts let Ismail Haniyeh and Amir Abdullahian meet, because Amir Abdullahian was telling them, you need to let the civilian hostages go, and you need to let the Qataris mediate and effect the release of the hostages. But there were other statements that were coming out of Iran. Just bear with me as I read you a couple of these statements, because they were crafted by the Iranians with deliberate care, and I think it's important for us to pay attention to read in between the lines and see what the Iranians mean by them. So on October 15, the Iranian mission to the United Nations sent out a tweet on October 15th. And the tweet went like this. It said, if Israel's apartheid, war crimes, and genocides are not halted immediately, the situation could spiral out of control and ricochet with far-reaching consequences, the responsibility of which lies with the United Nations, the Security Council, and the states steering the Security Council towards a dead end. Now, on the surface, the statement is somewhat bellicose, but interestingly, the warning is going to the United States, not necessarily to Israel itself, the states which lead the Security Council, so the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. That same day, Iran's mission to the UN told Reuters the following. It says, Iran's armed forces will not engage, meaning will not engage the Israelis. Iran's armed forces will not engage, provided that the Israeli apartheid does not dare to attack Iran, its interests, and its nationals. The resistance front can defend itself. So, that was the end of the quote that the Iranians gave to Reuters. So what they're saying is that Iran will not get involved in the military conflict unless Iran is attacked, unless Iranian interests, civilians, and Iran itself, the territory, will be attacked. So we see that within the week, from October 8th to the 15th, Iran has moderated and modulated its response, going from rather bellicose to somewhat saying that Iran will not engage unless Iran itself is attacked. Then on October 16, Amir Abdullahian said the following to Iranian television in a live broadcast. So he said, all possible scenarios are there for Hezbollah. Naturally, resistance leaders will not let Zionist leaders take any action in Gaza. So he's kind of saying Hezbollah will do what Hezbollah wants, but then on the 29th of October, President Raisi told Al Jazeera television the following. Resistance groups act independently in diagnosis, decision, and action when it comes to Israel. Resistance groups act independently when it comes to diagnosis, decision, and action. And again, what Iran is doing is kind of distancing itself from Hamas, with which it has been closely identified, but also, importantly, it's distancing itself from Hezbollah, saying Hezbollah is an independent agent, and Hezbollah acts on its own. Now, let me elaborate on that a little bit in terms of the military dimension of the conflict and where Hezbollah and Iran stand in relation to the conflict specifically. Both Hezbollah and Iran, when it comes to Israel, prefer low-intensity war of attrition against Israel rather than full-scale war. They prefer low-intensity war of attrition. In the same way, for example, that Egypt engaged with Israel after the 1967 war. Kind of a war that would, over time, drown Israeli resources, drain Israeli resolve, and would be costly for Israel as a small state. That is Iran's strategic calculation. Whether it's the right calculation or the wrong calculation is a different story, but Iran prefers that. At the present time, neither Hezbollah nor Iran can afford a full-scale military confrontation with Israel. Currently, Hezbollah is not in a position to engage in a full-scale military conflict with Israel because of Hezbollah's own precarious position in Lebanon. Previous engagements, like the 2006 war, for example, have been extremely costly, and Hezbollah is not in a position to engage in a full-scale war. And what's really interesting isn't what Hezbollah has said or done, but what it has not said. We haven't seen Hassan Nasrallah give a speech, because if he gives a speech, he has to come and engage in his usual bombastic rhetoric, and so he's been, as a result, conspicuously absent and conspicuously quiet. Iran's military, at the same time, prefers military engagements on its own terms, rather than on terms that are dictated to it. It is also not in a position domestically to have a full-scale conflict with Israel. Iran, as you know, for the past year has been rocked, year and few months, has been rocked by internal conflict, internal strife. The legitimacy of the current government is at its lowest it has been in the last 43, 44 years. And Ebrahim Raisi got elected to the office of the presidency with the lowest popularity and approval rating, with the lowest election rate at 42%. The second highest votes were cast blank. And that shows the lack of legitimacy of the current policymakers in Iran. They're simply not in a position to engage in military conflict. And at any rate, if we look over the last 44 years or so, the military strategy of the Islamic Republic has been largely defensive rather than offensive. It has been largely defensive when it has come to various engagements and various conflicts rather than offensive. The one offensive example that I can think of was when Iran was said to have attacked Abqaiq, the Aramco facilities, although Iran officially blamed or said we didn't do it. They said it was the Houthis, but of course it's almost an open secret that it was Iran that did it. So a full-scale invasion of Gaza, of course, will be genocidal for Palestinians, but it will also be extremely militarily costly for Israel. Now, if Israel attacks southern Lebanon, and if the border skirmishes we've been witnessing for the last couple of weeks between Israeli forces and Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, if that were to expand, we will see a possibility of escalation between the Israeli-Lebanese border. That if Israel attacks Hezbollah, Hezbollah has no choice strategically. It would be political suicide for Hezbollah not to retaliate. If Israel were to attack Iran, same thing. Iranian retaliation will be massive. Again, for domestic political reasons, if for no other reason. It'll be massive, and it will most likely bring in the United States and American bases around the region. Just as a quick reminder, when the Americans killed Qasem Soleimani, if you remember that Iran attacked two American bases in Iraq. Then the Iranians came out and said that they fully anticipated that the Americans would retaliate and attack Iran. And they had said that in their strategy, they had highlighted or targeted 5 American bases in the region to attack. Of those 5 bases, one was in Jordan, and they had deliberately picked that one to make a point that we can hit that far and we're going to hit as close to Israel as possible. So politically, they cannot afford not to retaliate. So let me end by drawing some conclusions and say what are some of the conclusions. First and foremost, Iran considers Hamas resistance and its attack on October 7th as a legitimate form of resistance against Israeli occupation. Iran was surprised and was caught off guard, as were almost everyone else, as was almost everyone else. Iran favors immediate ceasefire, containment of the war, release of civilian hostages, and does not favor its expansion to southern Lebanon. And it has actually worked in its efforts to release hostages. It has been advocating de-escalation. And that's why, quite frankly, I was initially surprised. Iran has distanced itself from actions of Hezbollah, and both Amir Abdullahian and Raisi have said that Hezbollah is a free agent and does not necessarily take orders from Iran. Of course, the situation is fluid, it's extremely dangerous, and there's a possibility of escalation ever present. Let's hope the carnage ends soon. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mehran. Very good, very informative presentation. Now we move to Dr. Marwan. 15 minutes to you too. Thank you very much and good afternoon. I'll be speaking in Arabic. لذلك من يحتاج إلى ترجمة بإمكانه أن يأخذ السماعات الترجمة. The position of Iran, I agree with most of what my colleague and friend Dr. Mehran has said about Iran's behavior so far in the war on Gaza. I don't know if I'm going to say something that you don't know already, but I agree by and large with what Dr. Mehran has said, but I'll try and use some of the details that he mentioned to come up with the kind of conclusion that will aid us to understand Iran's attitude and behavior when it comes to the war on Gaza from the outset, when it's necessary to say, if we say Iranian intervention, we should specify what do we mean by that. If we mean direct intervention, I don't think this will happen. Unless, of course, as Iran itself was attacked. Therefore, many friends and colleagues pose this question: what will Iran do if there is a land incursion into Gaza by Israel? In my estimation, if that happens, Iran will not interfere. And even if Israel engages in direct war, an all-out war with Hezbollah, Iran will not interfere. This is due to certain considerations, mainly the historical precedent. This is the 5th war between the resistance groups in Gaza against Israel, and it's the 6th if the 2016 very short war is taken into consideration, and since 2006 until now, the rules of engagement between Israel and the Hezbollah are clear. So therefore, in the last 16 or 17 years of Hamas's rule of Gaza, it has not happened that Iran had interfered in any war between the resistance groups in Gaza and Israel. This is an important indicator. Secondly, if we want to understand Iran's foreign policy, and I'm sure some of you are better equipped and more able to assess that than I am, but the researchers, they call it the par excellence variable for Iran is the survival of the regime itself. Iran will not really risk anything that is likely to endanger the regime. I'm not talking about the fall of the system, the regime, but to weaken it even. If you want to understand Iran's behavior vis-a-vis the war on Gaza, and in fact in the last 3 decades, we should go back to the Iran-Iraq war in the 80s, because that war has caused Iran hundreds and thousands of people killed and a huge expense financially. This has changed Iran's doctrine, and that means that Iran will not engage in any war with a country or a party which is equal to it in force or stronger than it is. Then Iran, as an alternative, would resort to war by proxy and maybe resort to preemptive strikes to avoid the war coming to it. And whether we're talking about Israel or the United States, this happened. As we know, Iran now has proxies in Iraq, in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Syria. So it's therefore logical and rational to say that if Iran has created all these tools, all these proxies, then we can only conclude by saying that Iran will not engage in war unless what Dr. Mehran has said, unless somebody declares war on Iran itself. So therefore, in my opinion, the decision whether Iran will get involved in this war or not is in the hands of Israel, not Iran, because if Israel decides to attack Iran, then Iran would intervene. I think these details were important to clarify before I move on my intervention to 4 important points. The point number 1 is the role of Iran in what happened on October 7, then Iran's reaction to that. Number 3, what will be Iran's gains or losses if a war breaks out at the regional level? And number 4, what are Iran's choices or alternatives? Regarding Iran's role, I agree entirely with Dr. Mehran that Iran had no prior knowledge of these attacks. This is the estimation of many intelligence agencies and also sources close to Hamas and Islamic Jihad. Some go as far as saying even the political leadership of Hamas were not aware of it. As for the reactions from Iran, and this is for me, because I'm the second speaker, then I lose the advantage. There is an important observation, and that is why has the Supreme Leader came out personally to personally deny any role of Iran. I think Iran, of course, he welcomed the attacks, but he said we had no role in them. Of course, welcoming these attacks is harmonious with Iran's stated position, and that is the solidarity with resistance groups. But I think he was trying to deny any involvement by Iran because maybe in the beginnings of this war on Gaza, there were fears in Iran because the Americans started talking about a new 9/11 or changing the ruling system in Gaza or Hamas Authority. So they fear that this may lead to something which will happen to them similarly to what happened to Iraq in 2003 because what happened shook the West and shook the United States at that time. But this time around, on the 7th of October, the attack was really, it shook Israel to its foundations. It shook the West too. It was Iran feared the consequences. That's why the supreme leader had to go out in person and deny Iran's involvement. As for the gains and losses by Iran, I think both can be said. Iran will have gains and losses. First of all, the attack has brought the normalization process into a halt between Israel and some Arab countries. In my personal opinion, some of the rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia recently wouldn't have happened unless Iran really wanted to stop this normalization process, because this constitutes a strategic threat to Iran. I think this operation by Hamas, if it had not completely brought this normalization into a halt, it will delay it or postpone it for a long time as a result of what happened in Gaza. And I think this is a main objective for Iran, which was achieved through these attacks on the 7th of October. The other important aspect to this is Iran tried to give a position, a certain position, but also Iran wanted to use the opportunity in an opportunistic way, like many other countries would do. It's true that Iran always says that these are resistance groups, we'll always support them, and we support what they do, but maybe they wanted to benefit from the situation. Amir Abdullahian yesterday said Iran is ready to mediate to release the hostages, and the hostages can come to Tehran and we'll hand them over. I think this is an opportunistic way for Iran to present itself in a different light, that we're not only troublemakers supporting resistant groups, but we can do some good too. As for the losses of Iran will incur as a result of what happened on the 7th of October, despite the fact that the Aqsa flood operation, which harmed the normalization process, I think it has harmed the rapprochement between Iran and the United States. When just before that, there was a prisoner exchange and release of Iranian assets, and it was also reported for the first direct meetings between Iran and the United States in the process of being arranged, and we know that never happened since Trump departed from the nuclear deal, because Bakr and other his American counterpart, the meeting was supposedly arranged but never took place because of the attacks. And after the successful negotiation which led to the release of prisoners and release of funds, there's another matter the United States now is imposing more sanctions on Iran as a result of what happened. Some may argue by saying that Iran is already under lots of sanctions, but this may apply to China. China was in 2020 importing 800,000 barrels, and before the attacks it went as high as 1.5 million barrels. This is because America turned a blind eye to applying the sanctions regime on Iran. And there are some reports that the funds which were released and on their way to Qatar have been refrozen again. So we can say these were losses for Iran. As for Iran's choices, alternatives, Iran, despite what we've said, is in a difficult position. I don't think Iran would interfere even if Hezbollah gets involved directly with Israel, because this will mean that a direct confrontation with the United States and Israel. The United States has consolidated its military presence. It sent aircraft carrier battle groups to the region, and even so, Iran still has as a problem. What Israel is doing in Gaza is a regime change, and this is what the United States has done in Iraq in 2003. It wants to enter Gaza, destroy Hamas's military capabilities, replace Hamas's political authority with an alternative authority. This is declared Israeli aims. I don't think this will work, but if Israel succeeded in changing the regime in Gaza, this will be a severe blow to Iran, because Iran's main platform, so far as the Palestinian cause is concerned, if Gaza goes, then Iran will not have an opportunity, a window through which it can look outward to the world and say, I do not use the word that Iran can use Hamas as a card, and Hamas is not is not a subject or a follower of Iran. I think what happened was a Hamas decision independently, but if Israel succeeded in stated aims, this will definitely weaken Iran tremendously, and many people expect that if Israel succeeds in Gaza, the next target will be Hezbollah, because the threat Hezbollah constitutes to Israel is much bigger than Gaza. Gaza, after being under siege for 16 years, managed to do what they did on the 7th of October. What can Hezbollah do? And they have much bigger capabilities. If Israel finishes off Hamas in Gaza, it will turn its attention to Hezbollah, and this will be an even bigger blow to Iran, because it will be the turn of Hezbollah, and this will place Iran in a very tight corner. If they interfere, they will face severe consequences. If they don't, they will also feel some consequences. It's very unlikely that they would interfere, but in any case, and in my personal opinion, Iran is in agreement with Hezbollah to keep what's happening as a low-intensity conflict, and I noticed in the last few days it has become even of lower intensity than it was. Now the skirmishes are taking place at. Sorry, I've come to the end of my presentation. That's why it's likely that the confrontations between Israel and Hezbollah will remain of a limited nature, and this will enable Iran to say that it has a role to play, and they applying the strategy of the unification of all the fields of action, and Iran will continue using a very strongly worded language and bellicose rhetoric, but the militias in Iraq and Syria. Yesterday there was a new attack on American bases in northwestern Syria. There were some missiles attacks. The Americans responded almost immediately, and 2 weeks ago we saw some drones and missiles being fired from Yemen. So I think the situation will remain as it is, but my final sentence is even this strategy, the strategy of using Iran's allies as a war by proxy with Israel and the United States in attempt to lessen the pressure on Gaza at some stage will lead to the opposite of the desired effect if it causes losses to America and Israel. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Marwan. Now it is time to start our discussion. We have some good time to discuss this issue. So who would like to comment on what was mentioned? Who would like to ask some questions on some relevant topics that may not have been raised by the two speakers? Ms. Amani, first. Thank you. I'm going to speak in Arabic. My question is to Dr. Mehran. Regarding Iran's intention, as you mentioned, to disrupt the normalization process between Saudi Arabia and Israel. This was a motive for it to support resistance at the beginning, but through the code that you've mentioned, and the interview by Al Jazeera with President of Iran, Raisi, what I thought I understood was the fact that Iran wanted to be part of the military planning after 7th of October, not before. Because everybody understands now that nobody knew about the 7th of October except the resistance. But I thought I understood that Iran really wanted to be part of the military planning, but this was something that the resistance had refused. This is why Iran decided to change its rhetoric, that if the invasion happens, then they would partake with the resistance. Something else that you've mentioned, part of the same code, President Raisi didn't use the term resistance. He mentioned it in a different way. Is this his way of saying that resistance is no longer legitimate? Thank you to our colleagues. I would like to mention a very important element raised by Dr. Marwan, which is the Western military mobilization, and which is unprecedented in the last few decades. The last example of that was during the liberation of Kuwait. And he compared the current military mobilization because all the different military forces and mobilization that happened in the UK in the Second World War. So this strange Western military mobilization that started when the 7th of October, knowing that the Ukraine war is in the background, I would love for us to look at it as aiming maybe to block the involvement of all the allies to the military resistance in Gaza, or to prepare for the next phase. Israel has started talking about founding a new Middle East, or finding a new situation, creating a new situation in the Middle East. Thank you. Thank you so much. I have a quick observation to Dr. Marwan. If you ask any just regularly educated Arab person, they would tell you that Iran is playing an important role in the axis of resistance for its own interests and objectives. Now, as the moment of truth has come and the confrontation started with Israel, we see Iran abandoning whatever it had vowed to do before, as if, between brackets, it was trying to implicate this region in order for it to make the most out of it. My question here: is this considered as one of the losses that Iran incurred? Because the Arab region is calling for the support and help of Iran, Hezbollah, and everyone who can provide them with help. But Iran is not taking any action. What's going on right now in Gaza needs even more. Everyone was or had their eyes riveted to Iran. There may be a feeling amongst the Arabs that Iran abandoned them. Would this affect the perception by the Arabs of Iran? Thank you. Thank you, Doctor. Maybe we start with answering these questions.
Thank you very much. The question, I think there were two questions that Ms. Amani asks. One was Iran, does Iran really want to be involved in the military planning afterwards? I think it stands to reason that Iran is now or has been engaged in contingency planning, assuming that Israel, what would Iran do if Israel were to attack? And so I think that has made, the Iranians kind of are on high alert. The Iranian military must be on high alert. If we look at Israeli military operations in the past, the Israelis had this basic rule of thumb that in the past they would attack their biggest adversary first, their strongest adversary first, and then they would go after the weaker adversaries. And this time, of course, the more difficult adversary has been Hamas, not necessarily Iran. So, would they do as Dr. Marwan said? Would the Israelis indeed go first after Hamas, then Hezbollah, and then by implication Iran? I don't know. I really don't know. Does Iran want to be part of military planning? I'm not sure, but I think it stands to reason that they are they're on high alert. Then Raisi's use of the term resistance. I don't mean to be rude to President Raisi, but President Raisi has a reputation for not being able, in Farsi, in Persian, not being able to put two sentences together. In a country that prizes literature and prides itself for its rich literature, Raisi is famous or infamous for his inability to speak properly in Iran. And there are endless jokes about him. And something as simple as muqawama, resistance, he's really unable to use it in a sentence. So I wouldn't put too much credence in his use of phrases or words in a television interview where he's nervous, and he kind of if it's a television interview.
تمام. شكرا دكتور. اتفضل.
طيب شكرا جزيلا.
Thank you so much. You spoke about Western military mobilization, specifically American mobilization, because it's the U.S. that has dispatched military forces. I agree on the fact that the main purpose of that mobilization is deter the allies of Iran. They want Israel to be solely facing Gaza, Hamas, and not open other fronts against Israel, so it doesn't get distracted and militarily distracted, and so Israel can achieve its military targets as expeditiously as possible. Also, the U.S. wants to protect its regional forces. This is why they got 20,000 Patriot missile batteries and others to the region, because they have military facilities that would need protection if they came under attack, if there was a bigger escalation. So the main purpose is deterrence on the one hand, defending their own forces on the other hand. But in my personal opinion, an estimate, the U.S. has no interest in allowing a full-fledged war in the region, because this goes against their own security and defense strategy adopted last year, which states that China is the biggest challenge to the U.S. and that the U.S. is going to focus all its capabilities, including military capabilities. And we saw there were U.S. withdrawals from the region last year, including that of Afghanistan, and with a full focus on this pivot to Asia approach. China specifically. What happened on the 7th of October has undermined all the U.S. strategy premised on an Arab-Israeli normalization of ties, de-escalation with Iran. This is where the U.S. policy, or this is the direction that the U.S. policy went, and tried to find a way to deal with Iran through a certain modus operandi, and for the U.S. to focus on East Asia and China. However, the 7th of October has undermined all this, at least temporarily. So I'd be very cautious in my judgment. So it has undermined the Israeli-Saudi normalization track, but also it destroyed the Iranian-U.S. rapprochement opportunities, which could have gone even further. Some Iranians had agreed on some terms regarding the Iranian nuclear deal, and which would have opened further negotiations on this issue. So all this strategy is now gone to waste because of the 7th of October. So I think that these are the U.S. Objectives regarding their military mobilization. But let nobody think that the U.S. is going to invade another country in the region, let alone Iran. Of course, they failed in Iraq, which is much smaller than Iran. So I don't think anyone is crazy enough to think about this issue. Another question raised by Dr. Hassan, a dear friend of mine. I totally agree with you. But in reality, what happened in Gaza has some positive, many positive dimensions to it, other than the hardships we were witnessing right now, the large number of people dying every day with the whole world watching. But there are some positive aspects to it. For the very first time, I feel that there is an Arab stakeholder that was able to achieve whatever they achieved. This intricate and complicated planning of the operation itself, it's mind-boggling. And I wrote that Hamas's victory on the 7th of October was even much bigger than Hezbollah's victory in 2006. It went way beyond that. It achieved objectives that Hezbollah wasn't able to in 2006. They broke the image, the halo of the Israeli military forces and their intelligence forces. Another aspect, Gaza reveals the positions of everyone. At the end of the day, our Arab peoples are very emotional. Anybody delivers a fiery speech, people would walk behind them. What happens in Gaza shows that a true position can only be believed when it is taken during a time of crisis, a time of conflict. Otherwise, it would just be another position, another statement free of charge, without any implications. In my own personal estimate, everyone is speaking right now. Turkey, Iran, and the Arabs are very much alike here. It's just the discourse that may differ. One may have a very high discourse, cause a lot of noise, and you know the positions of Turkey that have changed tremendously from the torture of Israeli hostages to we know what's happening today. So it's very good for people now to see clearly the different country or state positions. But I agree with you. Regarding how Arabs perceive Iran, Many were the problems between Arabs and Iranians in the last 2 decades. The 2003 invasion of Iraq, things then took a turn for the worse. But then now with the Gaza war, things are much clearer for everyone. We go back to Dr. Mehran.
A quick follow-up to what my friend Dr. Marwan said, and in response, one of the questions was, has Iran abandoned them? As Dr. Marwan just mentioned, Iran has not had a positive image in the Arab world since 2003, and particularly after 2010, after the Arab Spring, with Iran finding itself on the wrong side of Arab public opinion. So I think it's damned if I do, damned if I don't. If Iran were to support Hamas, then the public opinion makers in the Arab world would say, look, Iran has taken our region to war. If Iran plays a role of de-escalation, then public opinion makers say, look, Iran has abandoned the Palestinian cause. So I think one of the things we're seeing is an interesting kind of reimagination of Iran's role in the region from, now all of a sudden we're saying, what happened to Iran as the supporter of Palestinians? It's abandoned Gaza, whereas if it hadn't played the role that it is playing, then we would say, look, once again, they've taken our region to the brink of catastrophe.
دكتور مهران اتفضل.
I think we have to admit that there is a division even within the Arab world regarding Iran's position, and this is very apparent. What is true that Iran always maintained that it supports the Palestinian cause and the Arabs have abandoned it, and they're rightly so. Iran is correct in saying that, but Iran's relations with Hamas after the Syrian revolution has deteriorated because Hamas sided with the revolution. Hamas fought on the side of the opposition in Syria. This widened the gap between Iran and Hamas. But when after the fall of Morsi, Hamas, when they found support in the Arab world, they sort of moved away from Iran, and I cannot deny that. I mean, I have a position I will not deny, but I don't want to be biased. It's sure that Iran supports the resistance in Palestine and in Lebanon. But when we are talking about the war in Gaza now, that people should not expect from Iran any more than what has happened so far. Also, if we think that the Iranian state would engage in war against Israel without Arab armies participating, I think this is very unlikely. I think maybe it will be war by proxy more than direct confrontation.
So that you can interact with me. The expectation was high among at least part of the Arab world that Iran would step in and do something. And the delivery is so low. So the difference is frustration. And I think this will translate into probably an anti-Iranian sentiments in the region. It would be more actually, Dr. Marwan, than we've known. So this is my point, that there's a kind of frustrations on the part of the Arab world that they were at least waiting for someone to fill in and step in. And Iran was actually just like Turkey, like the Arabs. I mean, the Arab regimes. Thank you.
It might not be a question, it might be a follow-up to what Dr. Mehran just mentioned about the position of Iran, where they are doomed to do and doomed not to do. It's actually not a position by the expectations made by the Arabs. I think it's more of a position that Iran has positioned itself into along the 15 years. They have the Quds Brigade They have been trying to find ways to Qudus through the cities of Syria, Homs and Aleppo, and they were roaming around the region trying to find a way. So it's not a position that the Arabs are being surprised by, okay, that Iran has an opportunity, but they cannot seize it. We are just criticizing the narrative that being built upon by Iran authorities, legitimizing their intervention in the region, where they're being hiding themselves behind the decoy, saying that they were trying to come across to Palestine, and the reality is not. Thank you.
دكتور صيام. طيب هناخد يعني سؤالين ثلاثة.
We will take 2 or 3 more questions because we're running out of time.
First, I want to ask your opinion about this Western rush to come in support of Israel. Do you see that they came to the conclusion that Israel is vulnerable and it could be defeated? And if that moment to be used or taken advantage of the Iran, Hezbollah, and others that could even destroy this entity of Israel. The second, don't also you see that the bigger picture, the Western countries are engaged in a war in Ukraine now. And that war was well planned, and Ukraine was the battlefield to destroy the growing alliance between China, Russia, Iran, and other countries, the establishment of the BRICS and the G20 and all that, so that the Western hegemony is about to collapse. So do you see that also, if they see Israel is weakened, that will empower also the other side to expand on their alliances and trying to solidify their positions, seeing the collapse of Western power and Western hegemony. Thank you.
دكتور مهند من هنا. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
شكرا جزيلا لهذه العروض الممتازة دكتور مروان. دكتور مهران لدي سؤال.
Hamas has launched a successful surprise attack against Israel, and it is counting strategically on the region to assist it achieve its strategic goals, because Hamas by itself, in military terms, cannot really face the US and its backers. But it's counting on time and also on any mistakes the Israelis make. But more than that, it's counting on the region. By the look of it, and with your presentation and Dr. Marwan's, that the whole region, whether it's Iran or the Arab states, gave up on the military solution, and they are not threatening Israel with any kind of military force. What is coming next? Are we going to leave? And I mean, are we going in the region? The whole region, is it going to leave Hamas to face its inevitable fate? Where is the red line? Are there any red lines at all, or are they going just to wait for it? And I have a second question for Dr. Marwan, and I will say in Arabic. Dr.
Marwan, you mentioned the blow to the normalization process. Yes, it's true. This normalization has been impacted, and we understand that from Saudi statements. But now, later on, when Israel gets its revenge and leaves behind a huge number of civilian casualties, Israel and the Americans behind them will seek a political solution, because the military solution will not be a solution. By then, maybe the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia will find an opportunity to lead the process, and this will be the cost of normalization. Last 2 questions, please. Assalamu alaikum. A question to Dr. Marwan. Dr. Marwan, you said Israel may have amongst its objectives changing the regime in Gaza. Will this mean that creating a system in Gaza which will be under the control of the West Bank, and after that there will be a peace process led by Saudi Arabia? Maybe they give some autonomy to areas, certain areas, and do you expect them having any plans for the day after? Does Israel really want peace or not? First, three main pillars. Will they attach Gaza after destroying Hamas to the administration in the West Bank to be like a regime of autonomy, not a state, and then followed by a peace process led by Saudi Arabia? And after all of that, what can we expect next? Will they end the problem once and for all? Last question there, please.
Ask a couple of questions to the speakers. Firstly, I wonder if in the research community, my background is in international law, so I wanted to ask if in the research community in political science and strategic studies, whether there is a consensus on the day-to-day influence by Iran to Hamas and Hezbollah, because at the same time that you take, you accept the idea that the 7th of October attack didn't have anything to do with Iran, it didn't participate in it, but at the same time, you do foresee the possibility of Iran trying to gain or try to get some influence in the strategic or sort of military strategizing after the attack. So I wonder if there is a consensus on the level of control or influence by Iran over these two groups. And secondly, whether you are yourself surprised that the 7th of October attack did not have any Iranian involvement, and what do you see as the strategic goal of Hamas in doing this attack alone?
Thank you. شكرا. طيب.
In less than 3 minutes.
Is Israel vulnerable? Is that why the West rushed to Israel's support? Couple of things. First, let's remember that we're entering election season in the United States, and Joe Biden is in a precarious situation. Just today, there's a report that his approval rating is lower than Donald Trump. If election were held today, he would lose to Donald Trump, shockingly. That's a person who's under all sorts of indictment and all sorts of legal trouble. So part of the wholehearted embrace of Netanyahu, despite the fact that Joe Biden doesn't like Netanyahu and all that, is because of US election season. But I'm also reminded of the 1973 war, whereby the Israelis were absolutely shocked, and the Americans rushed supplies and support to Israel once Egyptian forces crossed the Suez Canal. And in fact, in more ways than one, what happened in October of 23 reminds me of October of 73, because again, there the Israelis underestimated, dismissed Hamas, and in 1973 they dismissed Egypt, and then they paid for it dearly. Is this a sign of weakened Western hegemony? I think we have to wait and see what the historical trajectory is, and longer-term historical trajectory. There was a wonderful question about what's next, what's red line. My tragic sense is that this is not the first time the Palestinians have been abandoned to fend for themselves. They can tell you this since 1967, nor will this be the last time. They will be abandoned by their neighbors, by the Iranians, by everybody, and will be on their own. Are there any red lines? The European Union isn't even allowed to use the word peace, ceasefire. They talk about humanitarian pause. The Americans, the Europeans who were thumping their chest about Ukraine and war crimes and international war crimes, they've been deafeningly silent. So are there red lines? Where else do we draw the red lines? I mean, there's a full-blown genocide going on, and they can't even bring themselves to talk about peace. I don't think so. And one last point about consensus on day-to-day influence of Iran between Hamas and Hezbollah. They're two very different actors, Hamas and Hezbollah. Hamas is operationally not necessarily close to Iran. In terms of rhetoric, in terms of moral support, it has been close to Iran after they were able to patch up their differences following the Syrian civil war. But Hezbollah is much more of a proxy of Iran in military sense. So Hezbollah's military tactics are much more influenced and much more directly influenced by Iranian Revolutionary Guards and particularly by the Quds forces. And one of the reasons, and Khamenei and everybody else have been quite blunt about the fact that they want a land corridor from Iraq through Syria to Lebanon so that they can maintain supplies to Hezbollah. Not necessarily to Hamas, but to Hezbollah. And as Dr. Marwan mentioned, Hezbollah, we don't know how many missiles they have, but we can assume that they have a robust supply of missiles that either have Iranian know-how and technology or have been directly supplied by Iran. So Hezbollah, I think, would be much more closely allied in terms of its military tactics with Iran than Hamas would be.
شكرا دكتور مروان.
Dr. Marwan, thank you very much. I think Dr. Muhannad's question regarding the red lines, إذا كان لديك خط أحمر يجب أن تتصرف على أساسه, so that doesn't look like Obama's red line in 2013. Let me give you an example that the two different discourses, two different tones directed at different recipients. Abdullahian, the foreign minister, on the 15th of October said, stop the war on Gaza or otherwise we will do something. The Iranian mission at the UN on the same day says Iran will not interfere in the war unless its interests are attacked. One in New York and one in the region. This gives you an example of the way Iran is thinking regarding the affairs of Gaza. As for Saudi Arabia, I think this is an important question and it's been talked about in the Western media. After all that happened and all the military operation, can there be a political solution led by Saudi Arabia? In my opinion, Israel has never been really interested in making peace with the Palestinians. Every time the Arabs were bribed, now they say, please allow us to destroy Hamas and obliterate Hamas. Then after that we can talk about peace maybe. And this is what happened after the invasion of Kuwait and the Madrid Peace Conference and George W. Bush, after the Arab Peace Initiative in Beirut, in June 2002, when he was preparing for war, the first time he spoke about a Palestinian state was that time. Now they're saying the same thing. Let us destroy Hamas and we finish off this operation, then we'll do something. And sorry to say, this is bullshit. I use sorry to use these words. After all that what happened, this is not credible. As for normalization with Saudi Arabia, it was difficult originally because the conditions are difficult. Saudi Arabia wants a nuclear reactor and a defense pact with America in return, and this is very difficult. It's not that both sides do not want it, but the conditions cannot be fulfilled. It was difficult before, now it's even more difficult, and not just because of Gaza. We have American elections soon in a few months. In that election seasons, the American president will not worry about the Middle East or anything. As for the regime change in Gaza, I don't think Israeli thinking is moving in this direction, and that is attach Gaza to the West Bank, because Israeli thinking has always been to detach Gaza from the West Bank. And I don't think the Israeli thinking is in this direction. I think they will find a regime which will consolidate the separation, not the unification. For about the last 20 years, since the 2006 elections, Israel's strategy is based on separating the two sides. I don't know what kind of a regime they will establish, that is, if they manage to destroy Hamas. But I think what they are thinking about, what we hear and what we read, maybe the UN will have a role to play, the Arab countries have a role to play, and even maybe one of the reasons for the Americans to pressurize Israel to delay the land operation is what will happen next. If you go in, destroy Hamas, what do you want to do? Do you want to reoccupy Gaza? Do you want to stay there? So they want the Israelis to come up with a plan for the post-military operations phase before they go ahead with the land invasion. I think I answered the question regarding the peace process. I have no optimism whatsoever that there will be a viable peace process, because the Israeli right is getting more powerful in the Israeli society. For the first time in Israel, the government is a government of settlers. I cannot answer your question because the Israelis themselves do not have an idea. That's why there is a delay in the land operation, because the Americans were asking them, what will you do next? But I can tell you what happens next. I think more likely there'll be a new government in Gaza, which will not necessarily be linked to the West Bank. There will not be a political process. Israel, now maybe Israel is planning to keep parts of Gaza, to establish a buffer zone between Gaza and the rest of the occupied territories, and this will annex parts of Gaza. So what peace process are we talking about? This is a government of settlers. This is the first time in Israeli, and now they are calling up the help of retired generals.
Thank you. I thank the two speakers today, Dr. Mehran and Dr. Marwan Kabalan. I'd like to thank you for your attendance, and I think that this is going to continue in future sessions, unfortunately, of course. Thank you.